Hello, good morning from Toronto. I'm glad to be in front of you, albeit not in person. I'm honored to be given this topic to speak on, entitled Our Debt to First Nations. It's one that's close to my heart, and I hope I can share that with you today. When I think of our debt to First Nations, my mind is drawn in two directions. First is to the loss of livelihood and life, culture, and land suffered by Indigenous people. Secondly, and on somewhat the opposite end of the spectrum, is the personal benefit that I have received through specific individuals, what they've given and what they've poured into my life. Now, as was highlighted by a situation in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago, the relationship between Indigenous people and mainstream society is volatile. Given this, we should be asking ourselves, what framework does the Bible give us that we can operate out of as we interact with, talk about, and even think about Indigenous people? First of all, given the pervasiveness of pride in the human condition, it cannot be argued that we're not tempted to think of ourselves better than we are. And it was only 75 years ago that scientific racism, or the scientific belief that some people are better than others, some race is better than others, was only denounced by the scientific community 75 years ago. Now, the reaction to that notion may be a swing to the other side that obliterates the beauty of difference. We know that God values every race in all times and places. Acts 17:26 says, "And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." So, Indigenous people were here on this land by God's appointment. And that causes me to ask, was the way that their numbers were diminished, and their cultures, all but destroyed, really part of God's plan? Are reservations God's idea of pre-appointed boundaries? The process of land cessions was often the lesser of two evils confronting the Indigenous people. Their economies and livelihoods had been disrupted, if not destroyed, by the shifting population. So when given the choice to fight back or to receive payment in a land agreement which promised immediate relief, you can imagine which they often chose. But that relief and the promise of continued use of the land to hunt, fish, and gather was impossible with the influx of settlers. And so the promises of the government were not able to be upheld. And in the interest of more and more people moving in, Indigenous people were pressured to move onto smaller and smaller portions of the land. And this was not always done ethically. There's one instance I would like to reference as an example. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor gave orders for the removal and relocation of Ojibwe people from as far away as Michigan and Wisconsin to Sandy Lake in Minnesota. To achieve that end, the government dictated that treaty payments would only be distributed from Sandy Lake, forcing all those people to travel there. It was the fall annuity payment, and once they arrived in Sandy Lake, the territorial governor, Ramsey, refused to disperse the payments. It became winter as the people waited, and the rations that they were given were meager and sometimes spoiled. Dysentery and other diseases broke out among them, and hundreds died there and on the return trips home that winter. Eventually, these people ended up on reservations. I wish I had known these realities and the many more when I was growing up. But I think it's because of the messiness and the ambiguity of who is at fault that we tend to avoid this topic. And many of us were isolated, and isolation fosters ignorance. And I would add that ignorance is the opposite of doing justly, as Micah 6:8 calls us to do. And in the interest of reconciliation, it is essential for both sides to admit to their wrong. I believe that we could do more as Christians to acknowledge the wrongs that were done towards Indigenous people. I feel that we owe it to Indigenous people to seek to understand their story. This history and the ongoing realities of life for them have a strong effect on the individual, and I've barely even scratched the surface. Let me tell you about two individuals from Toronto. First, a man I'll call Dave. He's Ojibwe from Ontario. And the space on his birth certificate where a father's signature should be is blank. He'll never know his father. He was given up for adoption and became part of a large family, religious, a domineering father. The whip was always handy, especially for Dave in comparison to the others. And yet, we know how a person's view of God is so strongly shaped by their view of a father figure. So, can you imagine what Dave's view of God is? And yet, through this, he still longs to please God. But in many ways, his past and his pain keep him chained to a life of addiction. Then there is the late Bruce, who God took from his Toronto apartment almost 2 years ago. Why God took a man who had perhaps one of the most credible Christian Indigenous witnesses here in Toronto, I may never know. He was a man of God. He had come from traditional religious practices and previously had made fun of his family when they became believers, and yet in time he too gave his heart to the Lord, and he lived for him, and he did ministry on the streets, and he taught me the importance of prayer as he did that. He had a heart for Indigenous people in South America. He'd visited there twice and he longed to return. Bruce taught me a lot, and he honored me by sharing with me stories from his past. I miss Bruce a lot. You know, we are all well acquainted with the idea that Hollywood gives a distorted view of what life is really like in America. And similarly, colonialism, assimilation policies, boarding schools, and even some missionary endeavors have given a distorted image of who Christ really is. And that image has not yet been cleared by the church. John Piper relates in his book called Bloodlines that all races bought by the blood of Jesus will be made into one kingdom, and so to love Christ, we cannot be indifferent to the racial tensions that exist around us. And so I ask, what if our churches grew to have a more robust understanding of race relations? And what if we actively sought conversations with people who feel disenchanted? I'd like to close by borrowing a story from the African American movement. George Haley, a man who broke segregation at an Arkansas law school, was once invited to speak to a religious body. And he was asked what they could do. And he responded, "What could you do? You could speak to me." And he went on to explain what it's like to be treated like an enemy in your own country. This, I feel, gives a picture of the emotional and psychological turmoil that Indigenous people face. The effects are very real. However, there are many who, through the power of Jesus, have overcome these obstacles. People who I know personally and others who I read about in history. They're an inspiration to me, and to them I feel indebted. Thank you for your time, for listening. God bless.